If there's one character who's been introduced in Elbaf that clearly has a giant role to play in the final saga, it has to be Loki. He's got a multitude of important story beats going on right now, but the details behind most of them still remain a mystery. Like, we know he supposedly has a legendary devil fruit, but what is it? And how does his hammer Ragnir just bring down lightning out of nowhere? What are his eyes all about? And what makes him think that he's the sun god? It feels like Oda's building up towards something really, really important with this guy. Something beyond simply being the prince of the giants. And I think he dropped a major hint to where this is all going back in chapter 1154. It was something kinda subtle, but also oddly obvious at the same time. Because at the start of the chapter, we learned that Elbaf underwent a string of tragedies soon after Big Mom rampaged on the island. Things like sudden fires, windstorms, and of course a long winter that pushed the island into a famine. But this time period also coincides with the time after Loki's birth, where he was continually trying and failing to be loved by his mother Estrid. And just a few pages later, we learned that the long winter just happened to finally come to a close right after Estrid died, and right after Harold returned, who treated Loki much, much better, even holding him proudly and asking about his scrapes and bruises. Could this timing just be a coincidence, or could it be that Loki's suffering had a hand in making Elbaf the way it was? Almost as if he turned the entire island into the realm of the dead, where they've tried to cast Loki off to over and over. In fact, Estrid and these highly suspect silhouetted guys even spread rumors around town that Loki was causing this. They said that Loki's curse was to blame for the weather, which even led this hobo to attack Ida and Haradin. And Estrid lamented over this until the very day that she died. And while I think Oda's trying to make us believe that this is just a hoax, and I certainly wouldn't say that Estrid's someone worth listening to in a normal circumstance, I think this time she might be onto something here. Because what if Loki actually does have the ability to affect the weather? I mean, we already saw him bring down lightning using his hammer, so it might not be the most surprising thing, but as a child, maybe he did it subconsciously via his own emotions, which, if true, still wouldn't mean that this was all Loki's fault at all. It actually just makes it Estrid's fault, because if Loki wasn't suffering so much, then this may have never happened. This curse that Estrid's talking about is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense, because if she didn't bring it up and make Loki's life a living hell, then they might have had great weather the entire time. It's like that old saying, one man's curse is another man's blessing, which actually reminds me that this is far from the first time that we've seen children in One Piece unlock crazy abilities under duress. Like Shirahoshi, for example. She awakened the powers of Poseidon when she was just 6 years old without even knowing that she had them. All because her mom needed saving, which is a great example of what I was just talking about earlier, because Otohime was actually a great mother who loved her children, and thus awakening Poseidon's powers wasn't some curse, and instead it acted as a blessing that day. But if Otohime treated her children more like Estrid did, then I'm not sure that day would have ended quite the same. And there's actually a lot of other Shirahoshi and Loki parallels that we need to consider, since they are both the prince or princess of some of the most important islands in the story. And actually, speaking of that, another time that we've seen powers like this includes Momonosuke, who not only heard Zunisha like Luffy did, but was the only one who could command it to hit Jack and save everybody when he was just 8 years old. And with Momo obviously being the prince of his arc, until he became the shogun at least, that could mean that we are now 3 for 3 on heirs to the throne awakening crazy powers at a young age. And all 3 of these are even associated with the color pink, because Shirahoshi has pink hair with pink scales, Momo ate a pink version of Kaido's fruit of course, and even before that he wore a pink kimono with peaches on it, and we know from a recent volume cover that Loki also has pink hair. And I know there's quite a few characters in One Piece with pink hair, but I really doubt that this is all a coincidence, because these 3 even had important prophecies tied to them, because they knew even before Shirahoshi was born that Neptune's child would be Poseidon, a weapon that they said could quote-unquote destroy the world. And doesn't that sound kind of familiar? Because that was basically what Loki was telling us at the very start of the arc. And as for Loki, we were also told that even before Loki's birth, Harold already knew that he would be killed by his son. So there's definitely some prophetical element here with Loki, whether or not his curse is really a curse or not. And as for Momonosuke, well, Odin knew that in 20 years someone was going to come and save Wano, which was part of the reason that they had to send Momo 20 years in the future. And while we don't know all the exact details of this, it seems like they really had to make sure that he survived, because even when Momo read Odin's logbook, he said that he can't die. I assume this is because he controls Zunisha, who can knock down the walls and free Pluton, which he refused to do at the end of Wano, so that means he still has to do it at some point in the future. But regardless, I think that what this tells us is that these guys are all really important, even beyond the relevance to the islands that they reside in. There's something deep going on here, probably tying to the connections that their islands have to Joy Boy in the Void Century, because we already know that the Fishman had Joy Boy's apology on the poneglyph, we know that Wano made the damn poneglyphs, and Elbaf just has so much lore already, it feels like it's only a matter of time till we hear about Joy Boy's role there as well. So I think it would just make sense that the heirs to the throne among these 3 islands would carry some crazy importance, because these are also arguably the 3 most important islands in One Piece other than Laugh Tale. And that's why I've been calling Fishman Island, Wano, and Elbaf the Big 3 arcs for a while now, meaning that they're the top 3 in terms of build-up and foreshadowing in the story, with no islands other than Laugh Tale really coming close. All of them were hyped up hundreds and hundreds of chapters before we got there as like guaranteed places that we had to visit, and with Fishman Island having a princess who was an ancient weapon, and then Wano having a prince who didn't control an ancient weapon per se, but did control something almost just as crazy, and Zunisha supposed to destroy the walls to free the ancient weapon Pluton anyway, so maybe Elbaf is just gonna follow suit and have a prince who's also an ancient weapon, meaning that the reason Loki brought a harsh winter onto Elbaf is because he is the ancient weapon Uranus, or at least a part of Uranus, because as we've seen with Shirahoshi, there are usually multiple components. I mean, she wouldn't be all that powerful without the Sea Kings, right? So maybe Loki is just the one to control the weapon Uranus, and that's who's affecting the weather, which is something we'll bring back up later in the video when we bring up Loki's snake eyes. And to be completely fair, we don't actually know if weather control will be an ability of Uranus yet, because we don't know like anything about it at all, but since it is named after the god of the sky, weather control has been kind of the quintessential answer over the years. In fact, all we really know about Uranus for sure is its name, which has only been stated one time in the entire story, by Robin when talking to Neptune in Fishman Island. Although the anime had Neptune say it instead, which I always thought was an interesting twist, but the manga at least tells us that Robin is already aware of that weapon. And just like how we've already seen that Robin does not like revealing this information until the appropriate time, like telling us that Pluton is in Wano after meeting Sukiyaki, I think she's saving those details for Elbaf as well. And another fun idea that I think points to Uranus being weather focused is this parallel that Oda's built between Vegapunk's biggest creations and the ancient weapons, where Vegapunk almost made like diet versions of all of them, because we already know that he made something that was kind of like Poseidon since he was controlling the sea beast instead of the sea kings. And I would argue that he made something like Pluton with the Mother Flame, because that was used to delete an entire island, which was said to be an ability of Pluton. And I know there's countless theories out there about the Lelucia weapon being Uranus, which I've talked about in some other videos, but I think even if that ends up being true, the Mother Flame itself is still leaning more so in Pluton territory in my opinion, especially considering that we fought over the Pluton blueprints over the only other giant hole in the ocean that we've seen in the story. So I think there's some connection there, meaning that the Uranus parallel among all of Vegapunk's inventions would have to be the aircon, which controlled weather over the entire island. And actually, figuring out the weather was one of Vegapunk's first great challenges that he didn't even succeed until after he left his home island. And with Vegapunk set to return on Elbaf via cloning at some point, it might make sense to have the Uranus story come full circle here, especially with all the other Vegapunk satellite remnants making their way to Weatheria of all places, the island where Nami improved a lot of her weather-related abilities. It just feels like it's time for weather peace almost, and I think that would go double if Urouge or Enel ever made their way into the arc, which I know many people are expecting, including myself. himself, because it seems they're both from the sky island of Burka, which is the same island that Haradas is from, the guy who taught Nami during the time skip. And so all of these elements just make Elbaf the perfect place to finally unveil this potentially weather-focused ancient weapon. But all of this would still, of course, leave us with quite a few questions, like how does this power even work? What are the other components of Uranus if we assume it follows a similar paradigm to Poseidon? And just how will this kind of all unfold throughout the arc? And this is where I'm going to bring back some of the points that we've covered in my other Uranus videos up to this point. So if you're familiar with those, there may be a little redundancy here or there, but I felt it was really appropriate to bring all of that stuff back in context of Loki, because this guy literally ties all of those theories together due to his very unique set of eyes. Because while there are a ton of theories about what these eyes might mean, they sure bear a similarity to the typical snake eyes. And with this video being all about the god of the sky, and with Elbaf having so many Sky Island related themes to it already, let's try to think if we've seen any important sky connected snakes in the story, like the Kashigami, for example, the snake that the Shandorians revered as a god. And specifically, they said the sun god. And what does Loki believe himself to be? The sun god. I wonder if this all relates to the same original legend or prophecy, meaning that Loki has some kind of connection with these snakes. And I mean, we already saw that Loki befriended a ton of giant creatures, right? With one of them already being a giant snake, so I feel like Loki befriending whatever giant creature Uranus is going to be tied to kind of makes a lot of sense. And honestly, like, take a look at how big those Shandora snakes are. They're kind of the thing that you would expect to come out of Elbaf. In fact, I think that's probably where they all originated, or at least where like their common ancestor is from, meaning that all of these snakes might just be descendants of a more important type of snake from the past, like one that actually had godlike weather powers. And so now maybe we're just waiting for those powers to reincarnate into another snake, kind of like how Poseidon reincarnated into Shirahoshi, and then this snake will eventually work alongside Loki. Because in pretty much all of my Uranus videos up until this point, I've focused heavily on this snake and its offspring since Nola is around to this very day, because I still highly doubt that the Shandians would call this thing a god just for no reason. Because even if that specific snake wasn't a real god, since Nolan did take it out in a single attack, there probably has to be a real legend that they're at least basing that information off of, because these guys were not actually as barbaric as they seemed at first. I mean, for one thing, their race is originally from the high-tech city of Burka on the moon, they protected a freaking poneglyph, and they protected a golden bell which had things like a monkey with a straw hat etched into it, as well as snake symbols underneath. I think this basically proves that they were allied with Joy Boy in the past, and thus their god is probably more than just a random tribal legend, because it may have all started back with Joy Boy. So I think the snakes were probably something that they were protecting and revering, just like the poneglyph, because they have an actual purpose. And since they are one of these sky races, I think that's because they have something to do with the god of the sky. It might just be that like these serpents are to Uranus as the Sea Kings are to Poseidon. Or at least a specific serpent will be, because like we just talked about, none of the ones we've already seen were really all that special. And personally, I think the one that we're waiting for is inside Roger's egg. Because while we barely know anything about this egg at all yet, we do at least know that snakes hatch from eggs, and we do have a reason to believe that it affects the weather. Because for one thing, we already know that eggs and weather are related in One Piece because of Nami, who literally uses weather eggs for some of her attacks, which is a pretty random combination, I feel like. Like, those two things wouldn't normally mix. But then as for Roger's egg specifically, well, we saw it on Roger's ship during the Ed War, where a sudden storm came in and wrecked half of Shiki's fleet. And right before that happened, Shiki was literally saying how Roger knew the location of an ancient weapon. And I've mentioned quite a few times now that this probably has to be about Uranus, as we know for a fact Roger didn't learn about Poseidon until after this, and without Roger getting Odin or even going to Wano until after this point, I'm not sure where he would have learned about Pluton before this either. So I think this would all make a lot more sense if the reason Roger Roger knew the location of an ancient weapon, or at least a component of it, is because it's sitting right there on his very ship. Plus, you know, Shiki has flying powers, and in Strong World he wanted to kidnap Nami for her ability to predict the weather. So in general, I think it would make sense for him to tie to Uranus, as well as something that can affect the weather. And if that's true, then we definitely need to learn about that egg in Elbaf specifically, because we've already learned from an SBS that the animals in Elbaf are just like the ones from Strong World. And I mean, at least one of the Roger pirates had to take the egg and the Orojackson somewhere after they disbanded, right? I'm sure they just wouldn't leave those things out to dry, and since we just met Scopper Gaban, the last top-tier Roger pirate that we had yet to meet, and the Adam Tree is here, which is the source of the wood for the Orojackson, as well as the Sunny, I think it would sure make a lot of sense if Scopper just brought it all back here for safekeeping, especially since there probably aren't a lot of people seriously threatening the Giants, so the ship and the egg would probably be safer here than anywhere. And maybe the egg is just from Elbaf originally, so then it's almost like Scopper brought it home, I guess, which would kind of line up because the egg is absolutely massive, which fits into this whole Elbaf giant theme as it is. And going back to what I said regarding chapter 1154, if the egg had any role in the changing of the weather back then, like maybe Loki's emotions were affecting it, then that would kind of mean that the egg was in Elbaf back 63 years ago, so the egg could have just started there. But on the other hand, I also doubt that this would be the case, because we just saw that Roger had the egg 44 years ago when attacking the Kuja ship, which, by the way, the Kuja are also heavily snake-themed, and we'll bring them back up in just a few minutes. But the reason that this is so important is that this was also well before Roger even completed the Grand Line the first time, because that was 39 years ago. And since Elbaf seems to be fairly close to the end of the New World, I kinda doubt that Roger would have already made it to Elbaf by this point, because that would mean he's still 5 years away from finding Lodestar despite being fairly close. So while it's not certain, I think that kind of points us in the direction that the egg was found from somewhere earlier in Roger's journey, like Skypiea maybe. And I think I like the idea that the egg wasn't in Elbaf, because if it wasn't, then that would also mean that Loki didn't just change the weather because he was impacting the egg, but it means that Loki did it himself. Like, he can just affect the weather all on his own. And I would like that a lot more, because it just builds up Loki even more, and I love Loki. But I think that would also be the ultimate key to his snake eyes, basically. Like, maybe he just has the blood of whatever kind of snake is gonna hatch out of that egg, which kinda parallels Shirahoshi because she's also part fish and controlling the biggest fish that there are. And like we said before, this snake is probably like a reincarnation of a past version of this weapon. So now let's think if we have any kind of information on what this past iteration of this snake would have been like. Which brings us to 3 important snakes that we have not talked about yet, being the Hellfire Serpent, the Serpent Soaked in Blood, and the Jormungandr, which may all 3 be the very same thing, but I want to talk about them separately first, because all 3 of them already tie to Elbaf pretty closely. So let's start with the Hellfire Serpent, which is presumably this giant snake on the right side of the mural, one who apparently fought under the control of the Earth God in the First World. And it seems that it uses the power from the Forbidden Sun to blast things like this dragon that we see at the top of the tree. And then for the Serpent Soaked in Blood, well, that is another name for the Red Line. Dorian Brogy referenced this as the one thing they cannot break, and Ida later confirmed that this thing is indeed the Red Line because she crossed over it. And then lastly, we have the Jormungandr, an entity from Norse mythology who is also known as the World Serpent. But this name was already brought up in Elbaf because of one of the kids' nightmare drawings, which makes sense because this thing is a giant behemoth of a snake who is not only one of Loki's children in Norse lore, but was also said to encircle the entire earth and bite its own tail, thus making it a complete circle, which fits really well into the Serpent Soaked in Blood idea because the Red Line also wraps around the entire world. And as I was saying earlier, I think all 3 of these might actually just be the same thing, meaning the Hellfire Serpent and the Jormungandr are the very same, and it somehow became the Red Line in the past, which would tie really well into the Kuja pirates, right? Because not only are they snake-themed, like we mentioned earlier, but Boa Hancock also has the ability to turn people to stone. Perhaps another, maybe more literal snake princess was able to do the same to the snake back in the day, thus resulting in the Red Line. So I think that Loki, the egg, and even the Shandian snakes are probably all just related, originating from this Hellfire Serpent, or this Jormungandr, which again just ties so well into the Norse myth of it being Loki's son, because now Loki Loki is almost its son. And I think this would also give us some great context as to why the Shandians revered those snakes as a god, because that island is also where we first heard about the four gods, the sun, rain, earth, and forest gods, many of whom were mentioned on the mural, with the earth god even being tied directly to the serpent. So there's definitely some important connection between all of this. And there's also one other snake-related group that's worth mentioning that I think a lot of people forget, which is actually the Nefertari, because their leader was named Cobra. And I don't think that's a coincidence because, for one thing, one of their most important ancestors, being Lily, shares the same name with Amazon Lily, who, like we just said, is also snake-themed. But also, the Alabasta arc was centered around weather problems. They were facing a massive drought because of Crocodile in the dance powder. And this is what gave us that scene at the end of the arc where Vivi yelled out just as it started raining, making it feel like she made it rain almost, which has led to a ton of theories about her tying to Uranus as well. So it feels like everywhere you look, snakes and the weather are intertwined. And to continue this whole theme with Loki and snakes, I think we also need to talk about how this connects to Kaido, who also ties to Loki as well as snakes, because both Kaido and the Shandia snakes can kind of loosely be defined as like blue sea serpents sorta, because Kaido technically has a fish fruit just in the model of the Azure Dragon, and the snake in Shandora pulled up on Moose by swimming through the water, so it's pretty fishy as well. And in general, I think it's important to remember how important Kaido's fruit is, right? Because it was one of the prizes at God Valley, one that Big Mom went directly after, and the government even tried duplicating it, in which Guernica said he was glad that it was a failure. And I find it interesting that Kaido and Loki would tie to snakes, even if it's a kind of loose connection, because Oda's already been building a clear parallel between these two, I think. Like how they both jumped from somewhere very high up, attempting to pursue their own demise, but failed to and instead landed in front of a bunch of pirates. Also, one is an Oni and one is an ancient giant, both races who have horns. Both of them also looked up to rocks, at least in some form or fashion. And honestly, Harold looks so much like Kaido sometimes, I feel like they might be related. So I think Oda's just building onto their parallel even more right now with all this snake stuff. Maybe almost making Kaido into like a failed Loki in a sense. And something I find very interesting about these two is that Kaido's tattoo also acted as a foreshadow for what his devil fruit was, where Kaido had these scale tattoos on his shoulder and chest and ended up with dragon powers. So I wonder if the same will happen for Loki, who has wing tattoos in pretty much the same place. Perhaps that's a sign that his fruit will be sky related, which fits into this whole Uranus theme rather nicely. Or maybe it's just a foreshadow that whatever being he controls, whether in the egg or otherwise, will instead have wings and maybe help him fly and control weather all around the world. And honestly, tying this all back to Momonosuke and Shirahoshi, I think you could even reason that they too are like sea snakes or even dragons in their own way, because Shirahoshi is already part fish, being a giant mermaid, and even Ryugu Palace, where the royalty of the fishmen stay, come with a giant dragon statue at the top. And Momo obviously has a duplicate version of Kaido's fruit, so the same argument exists for him that it does for Kaido. And so I think the reason that Oda's kind of introducing all these loosely defined dragons is because all of them that we've talked about are actually Eastern dragons, which are very different from the Western dragons, which look more like a Charizard. And we already know that the world government prefers these types of dragons, like how they took a liking to Dragon 13 from Punk Hazard. So I think this is just yet another sign that the final war is going to involve, at least in part, a war between the Eastern and Western dragons, so to speak. Or maybe like the ancient weapon dragons versus the celestial dragons, you could say. But earlier in the video, I mentioned how Poseidon was kind of made up of three parts. Shirahoshi, who is the Poseidon, but is also more so the brains of the operation, because the Sea Kings that she controls are actually the Brawn. And then the Noah is just the ship that Poseidon is meant to use to lead all the fishmen to the surface by having the Sea Kings pull it there. So basically all three of them have to work in tandem. And I mean, even for Momonosuke, he basically has the same thing going on, because he's the brains of the operation and Zunisha's the brawn, and then Pluton is the ship that they're meant to free by breaking down the walls. Now, obviously it is a little bit different, because there's probably going to be someone else who will then have to control Pluton, which I broke down in this video here, but regardless, it's a similar setup of a team of three. So if Uranus follows suit, we would then have Loki filling the role of Shirahoshi, we have the egg or the snakes or whatever filling the role of the Sea Kings, but then what about the Noah? Is there a ship that kind of fills that void for Uranus? Well, we haven't heard of of one yet exactly, but we did recently hear about the Gale-Ra giants, an ancient group of giant shipwrights who may just be responsible for building the Noah, because that would explain how somebody made something so giant. Plus, remember, the Sea Kings mentioned how they would need the skills of that clan to repair the Noah, and maybe the clan they're talking about is the Gale-Ra. And honestly, I think they could have built Pluton as well, because the blueprints for it were held by Gali-La, who seems to have a connection to Gale-Ra. And so I think if there's gonna be an ancient weapon tied to the giants, the Gale-Ra probably had a hand in it. And with that 3,000-year-old lab we found, it might be more advanced than we think. And so what ship could this possibly be? Well, like I said, we haven't heard of it directly, but I think it might be the flying ship that we saw on the mural, because it obviously looks a lot like the Ark Maxim, right? Probably the most well-known flying ship that we've seen in the story. But I don't think that one can be Enel's Ark Maxim, because his was made rather recently. And we're looking at like the first or second world part of the mural here, which seems to depict the past. So this makes me feel like this ship here is probably an older one, maybe being the one that Enel based his designs off of, meaning there might be blueprints passed down somewhere for that one, just like there were for Pluton. And like I said, the fact it's a flying ship would make it perfect for Uranus. So maybe the remnants of it are just waiting somewhere up in the heaven realm, and this might even tie to how Ragnir works as well, because we already learned that the Ark Maxim and Enel kind of worked hand in hand. And I think it would just make a lot of sense that Oda would tie Enel and Loki to similar flying ships, because these two were already obvious parallels with one another. Both of them called themselves gods right away. Loki brought down lightning while Enel is lightning. Enel even used an attack called El Thor, which just builds onto this whole Norse mythology thing. And they were both kind of built up as like almost unbeatable foes, because Luffy needed the elemental advantage to beat Enel, and Loki required all of Elbaf plus Shanks apparently to take him down. So I'm thinking that Loki, the egg, and that ship are the set of three that we're looking for, and just like Poseidon, they will somehow work in concert to pull off something big time. And if Poseidon's purpose is to save all the fishmen when it's time to move to the surface, potentially when Luffy or whoever destroys the Red Line and puts the island in danger or whatever it is, then I think Loki might kind of do the same for the sky races in case their islands get put in danger. One idea that I had is maybe when Enel comes back, his Ark Maxim's going to be kind of souped up to a crazy degree, because he does have all that high-tech moon technology at his disposal, and maybe he's going to try destroying all of them. Or if it's not that, then maybe it could just be that the Atom Tree starts falling down, which is something I've talked about for years now. Because if there are sky islands up above there, and maybe a big one if it really does hold the summit of High West, that alone could be enough to warrant needing Uranus to come save the day, much like Poseidon is going to do for the fishmen. Or hell, maybe we should kind of think of this in reverse, because if the sky islands are high enough to avoid the flood, maybe the point of Uranus is to take people up to the sky so that they don't drown in the flood. I mean, one of the last times that we saw Dragon, he was talking about how people are going to start fighting over the remaining habitable land in the world, and finding a quick way to move people up to sky islands could be a key way to saving as many people as possible. But that is it for this video. Please let me know what you guys think about all of this down below, and if you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe, because we are literally on the precipice for 100k subscribers, which is just so awesome. But that is it for today, so until next time, later.